What is up, guys? Welcome to this episode of the American Deciding Factor. Uh, you have me, myself here, Isaiah Woodie, here with.
Cameron Hunt.
And if you haven't seen the other episode that is going to be posted in conjunction with this, which is 3 solutions that we can do to help lower gas prices in America, we just finished recording that one. They'll be kind of posted together, they'll be sister episodes of each other. You should go check that one out as well. Either watch it before or after, preferably before, but either one works. And so Cameron headed that show and gave us 3 good reasons or 3 good solutions that we could implement to help lower the gas prices in America. And in this episode, we will be specifically going through the response to the leftist idea or the critics who critique those 3 solutions. And we'll be going through and making main points to kind of combat those. And so the critics' main points that we're going to be addressing is that we should make the switch to renewable energy rather than oil and gas, and that number 2, oil and gas are bad for the environment and should not be used. And point number 3, we're going to be addressing that Biden is currently overseeing 9,000 oil permits. This is a big talking point right now for the left, and we're going to be combating that and giving you the tools to help beat your friends on that conversation. So stick along and we'll get right into this. What is up, guys? So thank you for joining us for
What's
this
up, everybody?
episode. So we're going to be going through on this episode the response to the critics. What are the critics' main point? What are their talking points when it comes to oil and gas? What are their quote unquote solutions that we know are not actually solutions? So let's take this from the top. Number 1, their main talking point is to make the switch to renewable energy. This is a huge talking point that we're hearing a lot of the um, elitists or insiders or the administration make, that we should switch to renewable energy rather than depleting our oil and gas and stinking up the environment, right?
Right. Yeah. Just go. What do you mean, Isaiah? Just go buy a Tesla. I mean, it's not
Yeah,
that
you
hard.
can't you
Like,
can't
just
afford
just go buy one.
you
Like,
can't afford a $60-$70 tank of gas. Just go buy a $50,000
yeah.
car.
I mean, it's pretty simple. Like, it's like homeless people. Like, just go get a house. Like, obviously, that's
Exactly.
the freaking issue.
So when we
Oh
address
man.
this, let's get into first what kind of renewable energy does the left want? Well, the Green New Deal is a perfect place to look when we're looking for that answer, because the Green New Deal had a ton of co-sponsors in the House, and it was it kind of set the standard and put forth the main goal of the progressive agenda when it comes to energy and what we should be looking for in a Green New Deal. So the main goal of the plan is to bring U.S. greenhouse gas emissions down to net zero and meet 100% of power demand in the country through clean, renewable, and zero emission energy sources by the year 2030, which, by the way, a different episode for a different day, but this sounds very familiar to the benchmark and the goals of the World Economic Forum, which, again, I said we will get into in a different episode, but some scary stuff going on there with that. So, one of their biggest forms of energy that they love to talk about is wind. Well, let's dive into wind a little bit. Wind is dangerous to the wildlife. It kills birds and bats. It messes with their migratory patterns and all that sort of stuff. You have to haul all that stuff out there and plant it, and it takes up physical space in their habitat. It's also noisy. It can get very loud. It's expensive not only to install but to maintain. This is big, huge metal that we're hogging, like pulling it out into the middle of nowhere,
Yeah.
basically.
The best. Like, we talked about this before. One of the craziest things, if the windmills, if it gets too cold and they freeze up, you have to fly helicopters with people out there to go, like, literally unfreeze them.
To go thaw them
And
out.
you have to go use fossil fuels to make your renewable energy work. Like, how awesome is that?
How beautiful.
Yeah.
And so, number 4, and this is the talking point that you hear from a lot of people on our side of the aisle, is that they're inconsistent. They suffer with what people in the energy community, I guess you could say, call intermittency. And intermittency is the idea that it's not a consistent and reliable form of energy. It needs a backup energy reserve for when the wind dies down, because obviously the wind's not blowing all the time. So it's faulty in that sense, big time. Same thing with solar. Another thing that they love is solar. Well, let's get into solar as well. Solar is expensive. It is also inconsistent. It's also very expensive to store. It has a specialized battery that it needs, these lithium batteries that we could get into. and I will get into that in my next point. But they're very difficult to move once they're installed. Once again, they take up a lot of physical space in the environment, and that could, in some ways, in some areas, displace the wildlife or whatnot. And it uses rare earth minerals, just like lithium, which is involved in the batteries, and then there's other rare earth minerals in the panels themselves. So let's get into lithium batteries for a second. Lithium, if you do not know, is a natural earth element. It must be mined for. If you have a phone, which I'm sure you do, if you have a smartphone, if you look, your smartphone will say lithium ion battery. It'll say it somewhere. If it doesn't say it in the box that your phone came with, I'm sure you can find it in your phone, in your settings somewhere. But our phones use lithium ion batteries. Um, the electric vehicles, like Tesla and all that sort of stuff, that's lithium batteries. Solar panels use lithium batteries. And lithium is an earth element that must be mined for. And if you have a computer or phone right next to you right now, look up lithium mines, and you will be shocked at how massive those mines are. And remind yourself that you have to get diesel vehicles into those mines to be able to pull all of that lithium out, which is much dirtier for the environment
Yeah.
than the renewable energies that they're wanting. And it just takes up a bunch of space. It's a huge chunk cut out of the earth. There's pictures of them set
That
up
they
next
can
to
never be
towns
they can
that,
never be refilled. Like once it's this
yeah,
giant, it looks like
looks like a
a
meteor hit the
giant
earth.
meteor hit the earth, and once it's there, it never goes away.
Yeah,
Like you talk about bad for the environment.
look at
That's
a
it right
lithium
there.
mine. Yeah, there's pictures of them next to towns, and they swallow up the towns. They're the same size as a town. They're huge. So it's very harmful to the environment to extract this lithium, these rare earth elements, and it gives China an economic power. If you did not know, China is literally sitting on, the rare earth minerals that we need to be able to produce a lot of our batteries. From 2014 to 2017, China exported 80% of our rare earth minerals to the United States. This gives them a huge economic upper hand. It gives them something that they can hold over our heads and use and leverage whenever they see fit.
But what do
So
they not have? Oil.
they
Very
don't have
important.
any oil. Japan found that out.
Yeah.
So now let's get into, well, what are the alternatives then? That what does the right want? Because I don't think that it's fair to say that the right just does not want clean energy. I think there is an argument to be made that people on the right are not against renewable energy. We're not against clean energy, so to speak, but we're just for different types of this clean energy. So one that's a really huge, that has a lot of support on the right, is nuclear energy. You'll hear a lot of people on the right talk about this. It's carbon free. It has a very small land footprint. It doesn't take much room. It doesn't take up much space. It can typically be put in a suburb or an urban area. Um, it has a very high power output, so it's able to meet the energy demands of the country. It's very reliable, can consistently be kept up. But the only issues with it is that uranium is also a earth mineral. It's non-renewable, and it also must be mined for, just like the lithium would be. And it has some pretty high upfront costs to get it started because you're talking about a pretty serious and pretty risky game that you're playing here. But it can definitely um, give you a big upper hand if you use it correctly. And the one big downside of this would be the solid and liquid nuclear waste that must be disposed of properly and handled properly. And there's plenty of ways that people are coming up with to try and help um, find solutions for what we can do with that radioactive material. There's people that talk about putting it in between plexiglass, and so that's a solution, but I don't know. You have to dump all of this somewhere safely. And then any malfunctions with the nuclear facilities, they're rare. They're very rare, but they can be catastrophic. But there's some archaeological advancements that have been made to try and mitigate those risks of catastrophic failure.
Yeah, like the one I always like to talk about is people like to say is they're like, oh, well, look what happened in the Soviet Union with
Yeah, in
Chernobyl,
Chernobyl.
and it's like, okay, yeah, but also that was like 50 years ago. I'm pretty sure it was like 50. It was like 50 or 40 years ago. The technology was way worse, and also you have to remember, in a place like the United States, the regulation for nuclear already is going to be so high. Like what
Hmm.
happened in the Soviet Union, the tests that they should not have been doing, like that would never be allowed to occur in the United States, right? Um, and also our technology has become much more advanced, and people are like, oh well, what about the thing in Japan? You know, a tsunami hit there, and then you know it a lot or like it was like some radiation leaked out of the plant because of that. It's like, yeah, well, one, there's kind of a simple solution for that. It's, you know, we need to put our power plants in
In like
places that
Nebraska.
well, not always there, but also, you know, in places that aren't going to be
Yeah.
liable for stuff like that. Like you need to try and like lower the risk for that as much as possible, but
Yeah.
also
Strategically place them.
where it was like that one in Japan, like it was not near as bad as Chernobyl. So, like he said, malfunctions are rare and they can be catastrophic, but
They
do
can be
not.
mitigated.
We need to emphasize the rare portion because it's not just like rare. It's like, you know, very, 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 very small chance,
Yeah.
right? And it's the same thing. We run the same risk with things like, you know,
Driving
oil.
your car to work.
Yeah, because or oil, you know, like there's been oil spills before too, right? But we're not just gonna stop using it. So uh, that needs to be emphasized, right? It's
Yeah.
rare.
There's plenty of nuclear power plants in America, just not as many as would say be needed to meet the energy demands of the entire country. But there are nuclear plants in America, and you haven't heard anything bad about them. They're running just fine. And so that kind of wraps up nuclear. So now let's look into hydro energy. This is one that, as I've looked into more, I have grown pretty fond of, and I think it would be a good solution.
Well, it's
So,
been around forever too. You got to
yeah.
remember things like, you
Oh,
know, the
yeah.
mills. So
Yeah, and sawmills. I mean, they would just like the lumber companies. They would just use the streams to their advantage, and they would anytime they cut trees, they would put the like I don't know. It's a processing facility. That's what it is. They put their processors downstream from a lake, and they would just throw the logs in the
yeah.
river, and just let it carry it down. I mean, this is something that it's
Well,
very
also
ancient.
yeah, yeah, but also like, you know,
They
like
would use the
they would
mills,
use
yeah,
mill like we would use mills to grind, you know, seeds and
and
stuff.
grain, yeah,
Would you? Yeah, I mean, lots
yeah.
of things. But anyways,
People have been using water forever for all sorts
absolutely,
of things.
because it
So
works.
hydro is the most widely used form of reliable and renewable energy, and reasonably so. It's inexpensive in the long run. It has a somewhat high startup cost, but in the long run, it pays for itself times over. It can be produced domestically. We can use all of the waterways that we have here at home in order to continually produce this energy domestically. So we can nationalize the market, so to speak. It can also be used to irrigate crops. So the leftover water after it is used or after we pump it somewhere, it's not. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not polluted water. It's still clean water, and that can be another great source for using crop irrigation and stuff like that. It's a great source of fresh water. Um, it's also a great source of clean and renewable energy, which is why we're talking about it. It is a dispatchable source, meaning that we can produce more of it when we need more of it, and we can also relax on it and stop producing more if our demands are met. Um, so, in those terms, we can kind of control it a little bit more. It is able to meet our energy demands if used properly, and the only downsides, though, would be that you have different types of setups with hydro. So you can have what you call a pumped setup and a pump storage system, and those can disrupt the natural flow of water. So in that way, it can be kind of intrusive into the natural environment. However, that kind of stuff can be offset with run of river setups, wave energy setups, which is very worth looking into, and tidal power setups. So all of those can help mitigate those
Like
intrusions on the natural.
disrupting
Yeah,
the natural flow. Yeah.
yeah. So it also another downside is it kind of relies on local hydrology. So if you have a drought or excess rain, obviously that can kind of play a factor with hydro. So that kind of wraps up that point of renewable energy. So let's get into the second point, which is that oil and gas are bad for the environment and that they just should not be used. Um, the main point here is transitioning away from this is from Thomas Friedman in a New York Times column. If I'm not mistaken, Thomas Friedman was Thomas Sowell's tutor.
I have no idea.
I think I have that right.
I have no
Anyways,
idea.
but He says transitioning away from fossil fuels would require the government to raise prices on them, introduce higher energy standards, and undertake a massive industrial project to scale up green technology. Well, what are we seeing today in America? Government is raising the prices on fossil fuels and oil and natural gas. They're introducing higher energy standards, which is included in the policy that we're going to get into in point three, and they're undertaking a massive industrial project to upscale the green technology. Think Green New Deal, which thankfully was cut off and was dead. Think the Build Back Better program that they're trying to push through. All of this sort of stuff is what Thomas Friedman is talking about. So, the main issue here with oil and gas being bad is CO2 pollution. That is the main talking point. That is what the focus is on. And the biggest thing about it is that CO2 affects the temperature of the world. And this is where, if you listen to the last episode or the other episode, the sister episode to this, we talked about how the rhetoric has changed from global warming to climate change. And this is where that comes in. So, does CO2 affect the temperature? There are multiple charts that show very strong correlation between CO2 emissions and the temperature of the surrounding areas. And while correlation does not always equal causation, we can kind of safely say that there's a positive relationship between the two if you look at the charts. However, if you look at the charts, one thing that a lot of people want to gloss over very it's very blatant and in your face. If you've ever taken a statistics class and read a graph, then you can very easily see this, is that the effects of CO2 on the temperature is not long lasting whatsoever. When the CO2 emissions go up, the temperature goes up. However, when the CO2 emissions drop, the temperature drops as well. There's no long lasting effects of CO2 on the temperature, and that is why the narrative has switched from global warming to climate change. Because in America, we have dropped our emissions, and those temperatures in some of those places are getting lower, but some places are upping their emissions, and those temperatures are getting higher. So you can't say across the board that the entire globe is warming. Obviously, that's why they transitioned so hard. Uh, this would also be because another reason the rhetoric has changed is because the Earth naturally warms and cools itself. The temperature is always changing. There's cores that they've drilled in Antarctica that kind of prove this point, and all sorts of stuff that you could pull
Right.
up.
The best point that I always make for, well, there's two. I can give actually two real quick, very fast. Two really great points you can ask people that are diehard into climate change and global warming. Number one, if the world was going to end in 100 years or whatever, if the seas are going
I
to
said it was gonna be
rise
12 years.
yeah, or yeah, like some people think like 15, but the sea's going to rise a foot in the next 15 years, 100. I don't even care honestly, right? Then and most of the time, those people are also the people that believe that like all the corporations are evil and they hate capitalism and all that kind of stuff. The
Eat the
first
rich.
question you can ask them is, well, do you think banks are always looking in their best interest for them, right? Like they don't care about the individual person or the small business. They're gonna be like, yeah, that makes sense to me. It's like, okay, so if that's the case, then why the heck would any of these banks give out loans or mortgages for properties in places like Florida? Or why would or beachfront properties? If that part of the world's gonna be underwater in 15, 50 years, 100 years, whatever, why the heck would they do that? Because they're just going to be losing money on their investment, right? And they might give you some weird response to that, but like it's a really good question to ask and make them think. And the second point is, um, whenever someone is diehard into climate change, be like, do you believe that the Earth naturally warms and cools itself? Now, if they actually have a brain on their head, they're going to be because, and this is taught in science class or whatever
Hmm.
you want to call it, they're going to say yes. We know
We
there have
look at
been
the
ice
Ice Age.
ages. We know there have been warmer periods due to things like Isaiah said, like like the ice caps. It's like, okay, so if you agree with that, then you agree that we might not know 100% if humanity is the sole cause for the climate or the global temperature changing, right? That the earth naturally cools itself, it naturally warms itself. We can't say 100% for sure that we are the sole cause, right? Or we are the main cause. So that is a good way to take the offensive on climate change.
Hmm. Those are good questions to ask to get people thinking, for sure. So let's move on to point three, and this one has become one of my favorite points, and this is where we get into the policy and the regulations surrounding the oil and gas industry, and how Biden himself has been detrimental. You see that Biden and his administration lately, Psaki and all of the likes, the cronies, they've been trying to shift the blame on the gas prices and the the price of a barrel of oil. They've been trying to shift that blame and say, well, at first it was Trump's fault, and now it's Putin's fault.
But
And
like a week
yeah,
ago, it
a
was
week
the
ago,
corporation's fault.
a week ago it was the corporation's fault. So the blame keeps shifting here, but it can really all be pegged straight to Biden, and we're about to get into how. So the third point that they make is that Biden is currently overseeing 9,000 oil permits.
So obviously
And
that means that
yes,
he's the
the
best
best on
president
oil.
on oil, even though we don't like oil. Makes no sense.
And
Anyways,
Biden himself has addressed this and used this talking point to say that listen, there's 9,000 oil permits, and those permits could be producing yesterday, today, they could be producing tomorrow. He said that himself, and so let's just get into this. First of all, it is very hypocritical of the left to say that because the other 2 points that we addressed say that they want to shift from oil and natural gas into some renewable energies.
right? Like
And now
why are they proud of it?
yeah, so now they're sitting here gloating and they're proud that their president, the most popular president in American history, is one of the best on oil and gas. And so let's just point out the hypocrisy first, but then also let's look into this and let's realize that the devil is in the details when it comes to these 9,000 oil permits. So Mike Summers, the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, he says that the Biden administration is misusing facts when they quote this 9,000 permits talking point. A quote from him from Bloomberg.com says, just because you have a lease doesn't mean that there's actually oil and gas in that lease. There has to be a lot of development that occurs between the leasing and then ultimately permitting for that acreage to be productive. I think that they're purposefully misusing the facts here to advantage their position. And if you look and listen to our sister episode, we talked about this a little bit about what goes into actually what these companies have to do to be able to produce this oil.
Right. Like it's not just, hey Jimmy, let's get out there with a drill and go get some. Like it takes millions of dollars to get into this business. Anyways,
Yeah, so let's name just a couple of those things. What happens between the lease and the actual production of the oil? So one thing that we have to do is we have to contract the oil rigs. We have to build a sufficient inventory of permits before the rigs are even contracted. We have to put a drilling plan together. We have to secure rights of way from both state and private landowners to be able to use the land to drill. And we have to determine, based on the market, whether or not it would be worth the time and money to even go forth with this plan. The way that the domestic and global approach is to oil and gas production, would it be worth the time? So, what is the administration? What is the domestic stance towards this industry? Well, Secretarial Order number 3395. Remember that if anyone ever asks you what kind of policy has Biden put into place, remember two things that we're going to get into: Secretarial Order 3395 and Executive Order 14008. So, this 3395 was enacted January 20th, 2021, the day that Joe Biden stepped foot into the White House. And it basically put a suspension of powers on granting rights of way. Uh, it put a suspension on approving plans of operation or to amend existing plans of operation, and the suspension of power to issue any onshore or offshore fossil fuel authorization, saying that no one could drill onshore or offshore. So it was a temporary measure, and a lot of people, when you say that, if they know what you're talking about, they will tell you that it was a temporary measure and that it has expired. But it was later revisited and actually extended in order to provide time for this executive order 14008. So 14008, also known as Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. If you look into that, we get into Section 205, which calls for a carbon pollution-free electricity sector no later than 2035. Section 208 says, to the extent consistent with the law, the Secretary of the Interior shall pause new oil and natural gas leases on public lands or in offshore waters. It put a pause on the leases for these production companies. Section 209 says The director of the Office of Management and Budget shall seek to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies from the budget request for the fiscal year 2022. That is the year that we are in right now. Fiscal year 2022, they have dropped fossil fuel subsidies from the budget. And this Executive Order 14008 does not provide any source of legal authority for any of these mandates that it puts in. The only thing it does is it lists 21 different bureaucracies. There's 21 different bureaucracies listed, and now these oil companies get to go and play pass around with these 21 different bureaus and get caught up in a bunch of red tape and regulation and never see the light of day. So then, in response, the U.S. Department of the Interior, in response to 14008, said that they are currently overseeing, um, 26.6 million acres of land used for oil production with nearly 96,100 wells. And they say that nearly 53% of that is unproductive. And because 53% of it is unproductive, they're now saying that they need to seize it for other public goods, such as shared public lands like conservation or recreation. But that just goes to show that those 9,000 leases does not always mean that there's
Right.
production there.
Literally over half of it is not even. There's no production.
Exactly.
So
So
you could basically just slash that number in half already.
yes, and also in response, they increased the rental rates for future leases. So it's going to cost these production companies more to be able to get in there.
Which will affect the price because the more cost they have, the more it's going to cost for the oil.
And they've called for a modernization on the federal oil and gas program. What does modernization mean? Modernization, as we've talked about, means getting rid of oil and gas, and their policy shows that they are wanting to do this, they're wanting to implement this, and they're wanting to get rid of future leases, tighten restrictions, and move towards renewable energies at a rate that is way too early. So, with all that put in place, let's see what would happen. Let's speculate
Which
for
is
a
a
second.
lot.
Yeah.
That is so much
It
put in place
it
to
basically
hurt
ties their
companies.
hands. Yeah. There's nothing they can do at this point.
But-
However,
But Biden is the best on oil and gas, even
Okay.
though we hate it, obviously.
absolutely.
Because Jen Psaki said so.
Look at the policy.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, most people aren't going to look into this, but that's why we're looking into it for you so that you have the facts at your disposal.
Absolutely.
So, what if these oil companies get their hands on some gas? What if they're able to get in there, drill, get their product, and actually try to put it to market? Well, subsidies have been stripped, so there's no support for them from the federal government as of this year. There's been a pause put on the Keystone XL pipeline, as we talked about in the sister episode.
Right,
And
it literally it's been abandoned by the
Yeah,
company. It's been
it's-
abandoned. The
it's
Keystone
no
XL
longer-
pipeline is no longer a thing.
It is no longer even in thought. So it would make it extremely more costly and dangerous to transport and to actually be put into use, which you would see those prices. Those prices would be passed on to you at the pump and in other places that oil is used for. As we know, it's not just gasoline.
Gasoline, yeah.
Yeah. So
That's a big use for it.
it is. So domestic policy leans in the direction of subsidizing renewables, as we can see in the policy. This would imply higher prices that would be associated with oil and liquid natural gas. So that would be another downside to even if these companies could get their hands on it. And Biden prefers OPEC oil over domestic oil, anyways. So even if we were to get some domestic oil, Biden would go overseas, as they always do, to try and outsource our products here at home. He's just not competent. He's just not smart. He doesn't want to support American business, despite what he says at the State of the Union. And he has recently actually turned to Venezuela to ask for help.
Right, our great friend Maduro, right? Obviously,
Absolutely.
we just love him so
what a
much.
kind man.
Yeah, what a great nation he's created.
So in conclusion,
Sarcasm.
what should our stance be here? What is the stance at deciding factor, and what should our stance be? Our look on this as a, I guess, side of politics that we should be attacking from. So we should try to mitigate the unreliable nature of renewable energy by using oil and gas until we can make a seamless transition fully and easily into those renewables. And me personally, I think that's probably 100 years down the line.
Right.
Uh,
Well, it's like why transition whenever we can use stuff that was given to us, right? Why not
Absolutely.
use it? Doesn't make any sense.
So another thing that we can do is we can use clean energy that we know actually works, such as nuclear and hydro. We should be using those and looking towards subsidizing those rather than going towards stuff that we know is completely ineffective.
And it's going to help China. That honestly, if you're coming especially from like a nationalist perspective, right?
That's one of the biggest
If you
points.
want to make China the world superpower, make the Chinese yen, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the world reserve currency, you love renewable energy that is wind and solar because and electric cars because that makes China rich, baby.
It
That
makes them a
helps their economy.
powerhouse.
Right.
And they've already passed our economy anyways, so why not just give them a little bit more help? But another thing that we need to do on the right is we need to completely obliterate the narrative that oil and gas are going to be the death of the world. Oil and gas are not as harmful to the environment as we are made out to believe, and it will be okay to use them until we can, like I said, easily and seamlessly transition to those renewable energies. So, another thing that we talked about in the sister episode, we need to reduce the red tape and regulation. We need to get rid of Secretarial Order 3395. We need to get rid of Executive Order 14008, which, given that Trump or another Republican has put in 2024, that should and I believe will happen. We need to unleash the American energy sector. We need to continue to subsidize oil and gas as a viable and useful form of energy. We need to buy American oil and gas and not turn to OPEC. We need to make it easy to transport, aka get started on the Keystone XL pipeline, because it will help lower the costs and Americans will see the benefits of that. So, with all this said, Biden could lower the price of gas with the stroke of a pen, but he simply will not. The only reason for the high gas prices is because of Biden's incompetency. It's not the Russian invasion, it's not Trump. This is Biden's disaster, and it quite literally began on the day that he was inaugurated, January 20th, 2021, as soon as he stepped into office with the signing of Secretarial Order 3395. It was on Inauguration Day that this crisis began, and it is his fault, it is nobody else's. So, with that being said, do you have any closing words?
No, I mean, after especially hearing about the 3395 and the executive order, what was it, 40018 or something like?
14008.
Yeah, there you go. It's very clear that the reason why our gas prices, especially in America, right? According to like even the WTI benchmark, which is the West Texas Intermediate benchmark, being at prices like $109, because our oil is still lower price here than around the world. Like while it's only like 419, 430 where we live, it's way higher in other places across the world because while OPEC is selling for like 130 bucks, here at home it's only selling for like 109, $110, which shows right that it is totally possible for us as Americans, despite the regulation that we already have in place, despite like the more labor we have to pay, it is possible for Americans to produce at a lower price, but we are being handicapped solely by this administration because of the policies that they create, and that Biden could get rid of them and unleash the American energy sector if he were to get rid of these EOs. So yeah, with that, I'm pretty much done.
All right. Well, thank you guys for tuning in, listening, and watching. As this set of sister episodes is our first video recorded episodes of the American Deciding Factor podcast. So thank you guys for tuning in. We hope you learned something with this, and remember that liberty necessitates continuous action.